Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Something quiet, a little misleading, and strangely comforting in how wrong it all is. Before you settle in, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe pull a blanket over your shoulders and let your mind slow down. Wherever you are in the world right now, and whatever time it is, just let it be soft for a while. Tonight we're not diving into a single king or a dramatic war. No, that would be far too organized. Instead, we're drifting through 6 of the most stubborn myths about the Middle Ages, those half-true, half-invented stories that survived longer than most kings. And like many things from that era, they are a bit messy, slightly exaggerated, and occasionally just completely wrong. So let's begin gently, with a world that people love to call dark. Now, when most people hear the phrase Middle Ages, they tend to picture something gloomy, endless mud, grey skies, a permanent smell of damp straw and regret. Everyone is either sick, starving, or dramatically dying in a corner. And of course, nobody smiles. Smiling was probably illegal. This idea even has a name. People call it the Dark Ages, which sounds dramatic and a little like a fantasy title. But here's the thing. It wasn't actually that dark. Yes, life could be hard. People worked long hours, mostly because farming does not care about your sleep schedule. But it wasn't some endless nightmare. In fact, people were surprisingly busy inventing things, improving tools, and, quite inconveniently for the myth, making progress. Take agriculture, for example. Medieval farmers were not just randomly throwing seeds into the ground and hoping for the best. They developed systems like crop rotation, which sounds boring, and it is. But it also kept soil healthy and increased food production, which is kind of important if you enjoy not starving. And then there were towns. Actual towns with markets and workshops. Life had rhythm. There were festivals, fairs, and occasional celebrations that didn't involve doom. Even education didn't vanish into some intellectual void. Universities began to appear. Scholars debated philosophy, science, and theology. So no, it wasn't pure darkness. It was more like a dimly lit room where people were quietly getting things done. Now, drifting gently into our second myth, one that involves a lot more personal space issues. The idea that medieval people never bathed. Ah, yes, the classic image. A peasant, covered in dirt, having not seen water since birth. It's a powerful image and not entirely accurate. People in the Middle Ages did, in fact, bathe. Quite regularly, depending on where they lived and what they could afford. There were public bathhouses in many towns, warm water, shared spaces, and the occasional awkward eye contact. It was a social activity. Now, were they as obsessed with hygiene as we are today? Not quite. But they understood cleanliness. They washed their hands and faces. But the idea that everyone was constantly filthy is more myth than reality. It's a bit like assuming everyone today lives inside their laundry pile. Now let's slowly wander into another popular belief. The myth that people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat. This one has survived because it makes modern people feel superior. But the truth is, educated medieval people knew the earth was round. Writers, theologians, and scientists discussed a spherical earth quite casually. Nobody was dramatically falling off the edge into the abyss. Even sailors understood this. Navigation depends on it, and while it wasn't perfect, it worked well enough to avoid sailing into nothingness. Now let's drift into a more emotional myth. The idea that parents didn't love their children. But medieval parents absolutely loved their children, deeply, fiercely, sometimes anxiously. Letters and personal writings show clear affection. Mothers expressing fear, hope, and care that feels very familiar even now. They were not emotionally detached figures. They were people. Which brings us to another myth, the idea that knights were shining heroes of perfect honor. The reality was often less cinematic. Knights were warriors, and like many warriors, they could be brave, skilled, and also occasionally reckless, rude, or just deeply inconvenient. The concept of chivalry did exist, but these were ideals, not always followed. Some were essentially professional troublemakers with expensive equipment. And finally, we arrive at the last myth, the idea that medieval people never traveled, that they lived and died in the same village. But travel absolutely happened. Merchants moved between towns. Pilgrims traveled long distances, sometimes across entire continents. The medieval world was more connected than we imagine, not in the digital way, but in a slower, steady rhythm of movement. As we come to the end, you might notice a pattern. The Middle Ages were not dark, dirty, or ignorant. They were human. In the next part, we'll drift even deeper into these myths, and perhaps uncover a few more quiet truths hiding beneath them. So, as we continue drifting through this slightly misunderstood world, you might notice something quietly amusing. The Middle Ages have a bit of a reputation problem. It's as if history collectively agreed to give them a bad review and then never updated it. Which brings us gently into another myth, one that suggests medieval people spent most of their time doing absolutely nothing, intellectually speaking. The idea that the Middle Ages were completely anti-science. Now, this is a comforting myth if you enjoy imagining a long stretch of time where curiosity simply took a nap. But in reality, people were thinking, constantly, sometimes too much. Scholars debated ideas about nature, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. They read ancient texts, translated them, argued over them, and occasionally misunderstood them in very confident ways. Universities became places where students gathered to learn, and more importantly, to argue. Because if there's one timeless academic tradition, it's turning a simple idea into a 3-hour discussion. Figures like theologians and natural philosophers tried to make sense of the world using both reason and belief. And while their conclusions weren't always correct, they were trying. Medicine, for example, was a mix of observation, tradition, and creative theories. The famous humor system suggested that health depended on balancing 4 internal liquids, which sounds like a recipe that went slightly wrong. But even within that system, doctors observed symptoms, recorded cases, and attempted treatments. It wasn't modern science, but it wasn't ignorance either. It was an early, slightly confused version of inquiry. And then there's astronomy. Medieval scholars studied the stars, tracked planetary movements. Their models weren't perfect, but they were thoughtful, detailed, and surprisingly sophisticated. So no, science didn't disappear. It just moved at a slower pace. Now let's float gently into another common assumption, one that imagines medieval life as a constant state of suffering, the idea that everyone was miserable all the time. Now, to be fair, life could be difficult. There were hardships and uncertainties, but that doesn't mean people spent every day staring into the distance, contemplating despair. There was joy, quiet, simple joy. People celebrated festivals tied to the seasons, harvest time, religious holidays, local fairs. These were moments of music, food, and community. Imagine a village square filled with laughter, someone playing a lute slightly off-key, and a group of people arguing about something unimportant. It's not so different from now, just with fewer smartphones and more goats. Storytelling was a major form of entertainment. Songs, tales, and performances brought people together. And yes, some of those stories were dramatic, but many were humorous, even playful. Games existed too. Board games, dice, physical contests. Humans have always found ways to entertain themselves, even when the rules are questionable. So, while life included hardship, it also included moments of happiness. Small, steady pleasures that made the days feel manageable. Now let's gently wander into a myth that feels a bit more architectural. The idea that medieval buildings were crude, ugly, and barely functional. This one quietly ignores the existence of some very impressive structures. Cathedrals, for instance, were anything but crude. They were carefully designed, mathematically precise, and built over decades. Tall arches, intricate stonework, stained glass windows that filtered colorful light. These were not the works of people who lacked skill or imagination. Craftsmen spent years mastering their trades. Masons, carpenters, glassmakers. Even smaller homes, while simpler, were designed with practical knowledge. People understood how to work with their environment using local materials. So while not everything looked like a grand cathedral, the idea that medieval architecture was universally rough doesn't quite hold up. It was thoughtful, sometimes ambitious, occasionally uneven, but rarely thoughtless. Now, drifting onward, we arrive at a myth that feels oddly specific. The idea that medieval people believed in everything. Witches, monsters, strange creatures hiding just beyond the forest. And yes, belief in the supernatural was part of life. But belief didn't mean blind acceptance. People questioned things. They debated. They tried to distinguish between rumor and reality, even if their methods were not always reliable. It's easy to forget that uncertainty existed. Not everyone agreed on everything. Some were skeptical, others were more trusting. It varied, just like today. And honestly, even now, people believe a wide range of things. So perhaps medieval belief systems were not so different. Now let's ease into another myth. One that suggests medieval society was completely rigid. The idea that no one could change their social position. That if you were born into a certain role, that was it. But while social structure was indeed strong, it wasn't entirely fixed. A skilled craftsman could gain recognition and improve his standing. A merchant might become wealthy and influential. Clergy offered another path, where education and position could elevate someone beyond their birth status. Even within villages, roles could shift. Responsibilities changed, opportunities appeared, sometimes unexpectedly. It wasn't easy, it wasn't common, but it wasn't impossible either. The idea of a completely frozen society is a bit too neat. Reality was more fluid, quietly shifting beneath the surface. And now, as we begin to slow down again, we come to a myth that feels almost poetic. The idea that medieval people didn't think about the future, that they lived only in the present, with no long-term plans. But people have always thought about tomorrow. Farmers planned their crops. Builders designed structures that would take decades to complete. Families considered their children's futures. Time for medieval people was not just a series of immediate moments. It stretched forward, just as it does now. They hoped, worried, planned, and imagined what might come next. The Middle Ages were not a different kind of humanity. They were us, just earlier, with different tools, different knowledge, and slightly more complicated clothing, but still human. And as we gently come to the end of part 2, we'll let these ideas settle for a moment. In the next part, we'll drift even deeper into more subtle misunderstandings and the small, everyday realities that tell us more than the myths ever could. So, as we keep drifting through this slow, slightly misunderstood landscape, things begin to feel a little more familiar. The grand myths start to fade, and what's left behind are smaller assumptions, the quiet ones, the kind that don't sound dramatic, but still shape how we imagine the past. And oddly enough, these smaller myths often say more about us than about the Middle Ages. Let's begin with something simple. almost invisible. The idea that medieval people had no sense of time, that they wandered through their days in a sort of gentle confusion, unaware of hours, schedules, or structure, just waking up when the sun felt right and going to sleep whenever things got inconvenient. It's a peaceful image. Also, not quite accurate. Medieval life was actually very structured. Church bells marked the day. They rang at specific times for prayer, work, and rest. These rhythms were deeply ingrained in daily life. People knew when to begin their tasks, when to pause, and when to gather. It wasn't precise to the minute, but it was consistent. Farmers followed seasonal cycles with careful attention. Planting, harvesting, each stage had its time, and missing it could mean serious consequences. Even in towns, markets operated on schedules. Craftsmen had routines, meetings were arranged. Life moved with a quiet sense of order. Now, gently moving forward, we arrive at another quiet misconception. The idea that medieval people rarely laughed. There were jokes, playful stories, and even written works that leaned heavily into satire. Medieval humor existed and could be surprisingly sharp. People laughed at everyday situations, at authority figures, at each other, because human behavior has always been a little absurd. So no, the medieval world was not a silent, humorless place. It had laughter, just quieter perhaps, and occasionally more sarcastic. Now let's drift into something slightly more practical. The idea that medieval people didn't care about comfort. Beds were often layered with materials to create softness. Straw, feathers, cloth, arranged carefully to provide rest. Homes were arranged to manage heat and light. Fires were central, not just for cooking, but for warmth and gathering. It wasn't about luxury, it was about making daily life a little easier, a little more manageable, and that desire feels very familiar. Now, as we continue, we come across a myth that feels administrative. The idea that medieval governments were chaotic and ineffective. But medieval governance was more structured than assumed. There were systems of law. Courts handled disputes. Records were kept. Now let's move into something more personal. The idea that medieval marriages were entirely cold and arranged, with no room for affection. Affection could grow over time. Partnerships developed. People shared lives, responsibilities, and experiences. Now, drifting onward, we reach a myth that feels literary. The idea that medieval people were not creative. Creativity was everywhere. Artisans crafted objects with beauty in mind. Patterns, symbols, colors, all carefully chosen. And as we begin to slow once more, we come to a final quiet myth. The idea that medieval people didn't reflect on their lives. Diaries, letters, and personal reflections reveal moments of thoughtfulness. People considered their actions, their beliefs, their place in the world. The Middle Ages are often portrayed as distant and strange, but the closer we look, the more they begin to feel recognizable. In the next part, we'll continue to drift, uncovering more of these assumptions and replacing them with something more human. So, here we are again, drifting a little deeper into this slow and slightly misrepresented world. By now, the Middle Ages are probably starting to feel less like a foggy nightmare, and more like a place where people simply lived. Not perfectly, not comfortably all the time, but normally. And as we continue, the myths become even softer, less dramatic, more like habits of thought that were repeated so often, they just stayed. Let's begin with one that feels oddly modern in its misunderstanding. The idea that medieval people didn't care about health, that they just accepted illness as inevitable and made no effort to understand or treat it. But in reality, people cared very much about staying alive, which, as it turns out, has always been quite popular. There were healers, physicians, herbalists. Individuals who spent years learning about remedies and treatments. Some of these were based on observation, others on tradition, and a few on ideas that sounded convincing at the time. Herbs were used for pain, infections, and general well-being. Certain plants were known for calming effects, others for reducing fever. Knowledge was passed down, refined, and occasionally improved. Hospitals existed too, not quite like modern ones, but places where the sick could be cared for. Often run by religious communities, they provided shelter, food, and basic treatment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always effective, but it was an effort, a steady, ongoing attempt to understand the body and protect it, which feels very human. Now, gently moving forward, we come across a myth that feels a little more emotional again. The idea that medieval people lived in constant fear, that every day was filled with anxiety about disease, war, or divine punishment. And yes, fear existed. There were uncertainties. Life could change quickly, sometimes without warning. But fear was not the only emotion guiding daily life. People adapted. They found ways to create stability. Routine, community, belief. These provided a sense of grounding. There were moments of worry, certainly, but also moments of calm, of trust, of simple acceptance. It's easy to imagine the past as overwhelmingly tense, but in reality, it was balanced, just like now, a mixture of concern and comfort. Now let's drift into something a bit more economic. The idea that medieval people didn't understand money or trade, that the economy was primitive, disorganized, and mostly based on guesswork. But trade networks were active and often quite complex. Markets operated regularly. Goods were exchanged, priced, negotiated. Merchants traveled between regions, bringing items that were not locally available. Coins were used. Systems of value were understood. Contracts were made, sometimes written, sometimes spoken, but still recognized. There was an awareness of supply and demand, perhaps not expressed in modern terms, but clearly observed. If something was rare, it was valuable. If it was common, it was less so. Simple, but effective. And while there were limitations, the idea that medieval economies lacked structure doesn't quite match reality. They were evolving. Now, as we continue, we come to a myth that feels almost visual. The idea that medieval clothing was dull, plain, and colorless, that everyone walked around in shades of brown and gray, blending quietly into the background like very serious pieces of furniture. But color existed, and it mattered. Dyes were used to create vibrant fabrics, reds, blues, greens, sometimes bright, sometimes subtle, depending on materials and resources. Clothing could indicate status, profession, or region. Styles varied. Details were added. People cared about appearance, within the limits of their circumstances. Of course, not everyone wore elaborate garments. Simpler clothing was common, but even then, there was variation, intention, and a sense of identity. So the image of a completely colorless Middle Ages is perhaps a little too muted. Now, drifting onward, we arrive at a myth that feels almost philosophical. The idea that medieval people didn't question authority, that they simply accepted whatever they were told, without doubt or resistance, but questioning existed, quietly, sometimes cautiously, but it was there. Disputes happened, ideas were challenged, not always openly, not always safely, but still. Scholars debated interpretations. Communities disagreed with decisions. Individuals pushed back in small ways. It wasn't constant rebellion. It wasn't dramatic, but it was present. And that subtle questioning adds depth to the picture. Now let's gently move into something more personal again. The idea that medieval people didn't value privacy, that they lived entirely in shared spaces, with no sense of personal boundaries or individual space. And while homes were often smaller and life more communal, privacy still existed. People created moments of solitude where they could. A quiet corner, a brief walk, a pause in the day. Rooms were sometimes divided, curtains were used, spaces were arranged to allow separation, even if limited. Privacy wasn't always abundant, but it was appreciated and perhaps valued even more because of its rarity. Now, as we begin to slow once again, we come to one final myth for this part. The idea that the Middle Ages were static, that nothing really changed, that life remained the same for centuries, unmoving, unchanging, like a painting that no one bothered to update. But change was constant. Slow, yes, gradual, sometimes barely noticeable from one year to the next. But over time, significant. Technologies improved, ideas evolved, societies shifted. What began as one way of living slowly transformed into another, not suddenly, but steadily. And that quiet progression is easy to overlook when we compress history into simple labels. But it was there, always there. And as we let this part gently come to a close, the Middle Ages feel less like a single frozen moment, and more like a long unfolding story. One shaped by people who were not so different from us, curious, careful, occasionally mistaken, but always trying to make sense of their world. And in the next part, we'll continue this slow journey, letting the final pieces settle into place, and perhaps finding a calm understanding beneath all the myths that came before. So, as we settle into this final stretch, everything begins to feel a little quieter. The big myths have already drifted past us, the loud, dramatic ones, the ones that painted the Middle Ages as dark, dirty, and endlessly confused. And what remains now are softer impressions, the lingering assumptions, the small ideas that never quite left, even after we stopped paying attention to them. So let's ease into these final thoughts, slowly, gently, like turning the last few pages of a very long, slightly misjudged story. Let's begin with something that feels almost dismissive, the idea that medieval people lacked curiosity, that they simply accepted the world as it was, without wondering why things happened or how they worked. But curiosity is a difficult thing to erase. It tends to appear even when conditions are not ideal. Medieval people asked questions about nature, about the body, about the stars, about belief, about everything really. Why does illness spread? Why do seasons change? What lies beyond the visible sky? These weren't idle thoughts. They were explored, discussed, and written about. Sometimes the answers were incorrect. Sometimes they were surprisingly close to the truth. And sometimes they were beautifully imaginative. But the act of questioning was always there, quiet, persistent, and very human. Now, drifting gently onward, we come to a myth that feels a bit more social. The idea that medieval communities were cold and disconnected, that people lived side by side, but without real connection, no sense of shared life, no feeling of belonging. But in reality, community was everything. People relied on one another for work, for support, for survival, but also for companionship. Neighbors helped neighbors. Families were extended, often living close together. Shared tasks created shared experiences. There was a sense of being part of something, not always harmonious. Disagreements happened, of course, but still connected. Gatherings, celebrations, even simple daily interactions, all contributed to a feeling of belonging. It wasn't perfect, but it was present, and perhaps in some ways stronger than we might expect. Now let's slowly move into something that feels almost intellectual again. The idea that medieval knowledge was entirely stagnant, that once an idea was accepted, it remained unchanged, untouched by new thought or revision. But knowledge moved, slowly, yes, but steadily. Texts were copied, translated, and compared. Scholars revisited earlier ideas, sometimes agreeing, sometimes challenging them. New observations led to adjustments, small corrections, slight shifts in understanding. It wasn't a rapid transformation, but it wasn't static either. It was a process, a gradual unfolding of thought over time, and that process laid the groundwork for what came later. Now, as we continue, we arrive at a myth that feels almost emotional again, but in a quieter way. The idea that medieval people were indifferent to beauty, that aesthetics didn't matter, that function was all that existed, but beauty was valued. Perhaps not in the same ways we define it today, but still appreciated. Art, music, design, all carried meaning. A decorated manuscript wasn't just functional, it was expressive. A piece of clothing might include subtle details. A building might incorporate patterns or shapes that added visual interest. Even everyday objects could carry a sense of care in their design. Beauty wasn't always grand. Often it was small, quiet, integrated into daily life. And that quiet appreciation feels familiar. Now, drifting onward, we come to a myth that feels almost reflective. The idea that medieval people didn't think about their legacy, that they lived without considering how they would be remembered. But legacy mattered. Rulers built structures meant to last. Families passed down stories, possessions, traditions. Writers created works that they hoped would endure. Even simple actions, teaching a skill, raising a child, carried a sense of continuity. People thought about what came after them, not always in grand terms, but in steady, meaningful ways. And now, as we approach the final myth, it feels almost inevitable. The idea that the Middle Ages were entirely separate from the modern world, that they exist as a distant chapter, with no real link to the present. But the truth is, the connection is constant. Many systems, ideas, and structures that exist today have roots in that period. Legal traditions, educational institutions, architectural techniques, even language and culture, all shaped by those earlier centuries. The Middle Ages are not a distant island. They are part of a long, continuous shoreline, stretching quietly into the present. And perhaps that's the realization that settles in. The myths were never just about the past. They were about how we choose to see it. Simplified, dramatic, sometimes unfair. But when we slow down, when we let the details emerge, the picture becomes softer, more complex, more human, less like a story about them, and more like a story about us, just earlier, just quieter. And as we let this final part come to rest, there's no dramatic ending waiting here, no sudden revelation, just a calm understanding that the Middle Ages were not as dark or strange or distant as they often seem. They were lived in, day by day, moment by moment, by people who woke up, worked, wondered, laughed, and eventually slept, much like you might be doing now, as this story slowly fades into the background. So, if you're still here, still listening, still gently drifting somewhere between curiosity and sleep, then we've reached that quiet place at the edge of the story. Not an ending exactly. The Middle Ages don't really end in a clean, satisfying way. They just slowly change into something else. A bit like how night turns into morning, without asking for permission. And maybe that's the most fitting way to leave this behind. Not with a sharp conclusion, but with a soft understanding. Because by now the myths have loosened their grip. The darkness isn't quite so dark. The silence isn't so empty. The people don't feel so distant. They feel closer, not identical, of course. Their world was shaped by different limits, different knowledge, and different expectations. But beneath all that, the patterns are familiar. They woke up with responsibilities waiting for them. They had tasks that couldn't be ignored, conversations that couldn't be avoided, and small decisions that quietly shaped their days. There were moments of frustration, of boredom, of quiet satisfaction, when something finally worked the way it was supposed to. And if you pause for a moment, that doesn't feel very medieval at all. It just feels human. It's easy to imagine the past as something dramatic, something filled with extremes, either romantic and glowing or dark and unbearable. But most of it wasn't like that. Most of it was ordinary. Long stretches of routine, familiar spaces, repeated actions, the kind of life that doesn't make it into dramatic retellings, but makes up almost everything. A farmer walking the same field again, noticing small changes in the soil. A craftsperson adjusting their work, just slightly, trying to get it right. A parent watching a child grow, slowly, over years that pass almost unnoticed. A merchant counting coins at the end of the day, wondering if tomorrow will be better, or at least predictable. These aren't grand stories, but they are real ones. And somewhere along the way, those quiet lives were turned into something simpler, reduced to a few repeating ideas. Dark, dirty, ignorant. It's easier that way, easier to understand, easier to remember, easier to separate ourselves from it. Because if the past is completely different, then we don't have to see ourselves in it. But the more we look, the harder that separation becomes. Because the details don't support it. The small things, the routines, the thoughts, the emotions, feel too familiar. And maybe that's why these myths stayed for so long. Not because they were accurate, but because they were convenient. They created distance, and distance can be comfortable. It lets us imagine progress as a straight line, from confusion to clarity, from darkness to light, from them to us. But real history doesn't move like that. It shifts, it pauses, it repeats itself in small, quiet ways. Some ideas improve, others linger. A few fade away, only to return later in slightly different forms. And through all of it, people remain remarkably consistent. They adapt, they misunderstand, they learn, they forget, they try again. Even the mistakes, the strange beliefs, the incomplete knowledge, they're part of that process. Not signs of failure, but signs of being in the middle of something. Because every time period is in the middle of something, even now, we like to think we've reached a point of clarity, that we see the world more accurately than those who came before us. And in some ways, we do. But in other ways, we're probably just as limited, just as shaped by the ideas around us, just as certain of things that might one day seem slightly misplaced. And that's not a criticism. It's just how time works. Each generation builds on the last, carrying forward what it understands, and quietly adjusting what it doesn't. The Middle Ages were one part of that long process. Not a pause, not a failure, just a chapter. And like any chapter, it makes more sense when you read it slowly, when you notice the details, when you let go of the summaries and sit with the smaller moments, because that's where the reality tends to hide. Not in the grand labels, but in the everyday experiences. A quiet meal, a shared laugh, a brief moment of rest before the next task begins. These things don't change much over time. And maybe that's the most comforting thought to take with you as this comes to an end. That despite everything, technology, knowledge, culture, time itself, some parts of life remain steady, not identical, but recognizable. And as your mind begins to slow a little more, you can let those images drift. The fields, the towns, the soft rhythm of daily life moving without urgency, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just the quiet presence of people, living, and now, there's nothing left to explain, no more myths to untangle, no more details to gently correct, just a soft space where the story settles and fades into the background. So wherever you are, whatever time it is, you can let this go. Let the past rest where it belongs, and let your thoughts follow that same slow rhythm until everything becomes still. So, even though we've already let the story settle, there's always this quiet afterglow that lingers, not quite part of the main narrative anymore, but not completely gone either. It's that soft space where your mind is still wandering, still piecing together small impressions, without really trying to. And the Middle Ages, for all their misunderstood reputation, seem to fit into that space surprisingly well, because once the myths fade, what's left isn't dramatic. It's gentle, almost ordinary in a way that feels unexpected. You start to notice smaller things, details that didn't seem important at first, but quietly stayed behind, like the way light would fall into a medieval room, not through large, clear windows, but through smaller openings, softened by glass that wasn't perfectly smooth. It would create this muted glow, not bright, not harsh, just enough to see by, and people adjusted to that, their pace, their expectations, even their thoughts, shaped by that kind of light. There's something calming about that idea, no constant brightness, no pressure to stay alert at all hours, just a natural rhythm of light and shadow, guiding the day without much resistance. And then there's sound, or rather, the absence of certain sounds, no distant hum of traffic, no constant notifications. Instead, there were quieter layers, wind moving through open spaces, footsteps on uneven ground, the occasional conversation rising and fading as people passed by. Work sounds too, tools being used, animals shifting nearby, small, repetitive noises that blended into a kind of soft rhythm, not silence, but something close to it, something steady. And within that quiet, people thought, not in rushed, fragmented ways, but slowly. Ideas had time to settle, conversations unfolded without interruption, even disagreements moved at a different pace, less immediate, more deliberate. Of course, that didn't mean everything was peaceful. There were tensions, conflicts, misunderstandings, all the usual elements of human interaction, but they existed within a slower framework. Less urgency, more space between moments, and maybe that's one of the most subtle things we've uncovered here. Not just that the Middle Ages were misunderstood, but that they moved differently. Time itself felt different. Not because clocks didn't exist in the same way, but because life wasn't divided into such precise, demanding segments. There was more blending, work into rest, activity into stillness, one day into the next. And that blending created a kind of softness, a continuity that's harder to find now. Now, as your thoughts drift a little further, you might start to notice how these quiet details begin to overlap with your own experience, not directly, not in obvious ways, but in small, almost unnoticeable connections. The need for routine, the comfort of familiar surroundings, the quiet satisfaction of finishing something simple, even if it doesn't seem important. These things don't belong to any specific century. They're just part of being here. And the more we let go of the exaggerated versions of the past, the easier it becomes to see that. The Middle Ages weren't a distant, unrelatable world. They were simply another version of this one. Less technology, different knowledge, slower movement, but still filled with people who were trying to understand their place in it, just like now. And as we continue to sit in this quieter space, there's no need to add anything new, No more myths to question, no more details to correct. Everything important has already settled. What remains is just the feeling of it. A soft awareness that the past is not as far away as it seems, that it exists, not as a separate story, but as part of a continuous flow, moving slowly forward, carrying pieces of itself along the way. And in that flow, there's no sharp boundary between then and now, just gradual change, small adjustments, quiet transitions that happen over time, without announcing themselves. So as this final afterthought begins to fade, you can let your mind follow that same pattern. No effort, no direction, just a slow drifting from one thought to the next, until even those begin to soften. The Middle Ages settle into the background, not as something strange or distant, but as something calm, familiar, and gently understood. And now, there's truly nothing left to add, only stillness. So, this is where everything finally comes to rest. Not with a grand conclusion, not with a dramatic final statement that ties everything together in perfect clarity, because history rarely offers that kind of ending. Instead, it fades, softly. Like the last few moments before sleep, when thoughts begin to lose their edges and everything feels a little more distant, a little less defined. And the Middle Ages, after all the myths, all the quiet corrections, all the slow drifting through details, they settle into something much simpler than we expected. Not dark, not backward, not frozen in time, just lived in. That's really all it was. A long stretch of years filled with ordinary days. Some difficult, some peaceful, most somewhere in between. People waking up to the same responsibilities they had yesterday, walking the same paths, seeing the same faces, thinking the same quiet thoughts they hadn't quite finished the day before. There's something almost comforting about that repetition. The idea that even across centuries, life doesn't always need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. It just needs to continue. And perhaps that's the final thing these myths quietly obscured. Not just the facts of the Middle Ages, but the feeling of them. Because when we imagine the past as something extreme, either too dark or too romantic, we lose that sense of normalcy. We forget that most of history happened in small moments. A conversation that didn't change anything, but was still remembered. A task completed without recognition, but still necessary. A quiet evening where nothing remarkable occurred, and yet it mattered. These are the things that rarely get recorded, but they're the things that make up almost everything. And once you start to see the Middle Ages way, the myths begin to feel less important. They don't disappear entirely. They still exist, quietly lingering in stories and assumptions, but they lose their weight, because the reality beneath them is softer, more balanced, more human, and maybe that's enough. There's no need to replace one extreme with another. No need to prove that the Middle Ages were secretly perfect or misunderstood in every way. They were simply what they were. A time of effort, of learning, of gradual change. A time where people did their best with what they knew, just like now. And as you let that thought settle, you might notice something else, a kind of quiet connection, not something loud or obvious, just a small recognition that the distance between then and now isn't as wide as it sometimes feels, that across all the years, all the differences, all the changes, there's still a thread that runs through it. Routine, curiosity, frustration, hope. The same patterns repeating in slightly different ways, and as this final part begins to fade, there's nothing left to analyze. No more myths to untangle, no more ideas to gently turn over, just a calm space where everything has already been said and no longer needs to be repeated. So wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, you can let this story go. Let the fields, The towns, the quiet rhythms of medieval life drift away into the background. Let the softened image of that world settle into something distant, but no longer unfamiliar. And most importantly, let your mind follow that same slow path. No urgency, no effort, just a gentle drifting from one quiet thought to the next, until even those begin to disappear. The Middle Ages, once full of myths and misunderstandings, now rest in a quieter place. And you can rest too. Good night. The idea of dying on a battlefield has always been oddly polished, clean almost. A dramatic final stand, a few noble words, maybe a sunset in the background if the timing is generous. History, unfortunately, had very different plans. It was less poetry and more inconvenience. Long, drawn-out, uncomfortable inconvenience. If you had the misfortune of being a soldier in most pre-modern wars, your final moments were rarely fast or heroic. In fact, there is a good chance no one noticed at all. You would simply become one more body in a place already full of them. Let us begin with the moment things start to go wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just subtly. You are standing in formation, maybe holding a spear that feels heavier than it did an hour ago. Your feet are sore. There is noise all around you, but it is the kind of noise that blurs together, shouting, metal, and distant screams. And then, without much ceremony, something hits you. It might be an arrow or a sword in very close quarters, but you often do not feel the pain immediately. The body, trying to be helpful for once, dulls the sensation. So there is this brief, almost confusing pause. You might look down and see blood. That is usually the giveaway. Now, here is where the fantasy starts to quietly fall apart, because instead of collapsing instantly, you are probably still standing there. If the wound is severe, the weakness comes next. Gradually, your grip loosens, your legs start to feel unreliable, and then you fall, not heroically, but awkwardly. Often onto uneven ground, or worse, onto someone else who has already fallen. The battlefield at this point is not a place that pauses for you. People step over you, sometimes on you. Most battlefield deaths were not instant. They were slow, inconvenient processes that unfolded over minutes, hours, or even days. So now you are lying there. The ground is hard or muddy. Your wound is bleeding. This is where the pain usually arrives, not all at once, but in waves. Sharp at first, then dull, then sharp again. Breathing becomes something you notice. Each breath might feel heavier or uneven. Your body struggles to remember how it used to do this. And here is the part people do not often picture. Time stretches. Minutes feel long, very long. There is no quick resolution, no fade to black. Just you and the noise of battle slowly shifting around you. Sometimes help does come. If you are lucky, someone might drag you away from the main fighting, not gently. You might be moved to a makeshift line where the wounded are gathering. But help is a flexible term. There might be a surgeon, but he is likely overwhelmed. Decisions are quick and not always in your favor. If your wound looks survivable, you might get attention. If it does not, you might be gently set aside. So you are left there again. The battle might be moving away. The noise becomes more distant. The ground feels colder. Shock is an interesting companion. It can make you feel strangely calm, detached, as if what is happening to someone else. You might feel thirsty, intensely so. A simple, almost mundane discomfort sitting there alongside everything else. If no one comes, the process continues. The sun might move across the sky. The temperature begins to drop. It is not dramatic. It is not fast. It is more like a gradual dimming. The pain might lessen because your body is running out of energy. At some point you might lose consciousness, not in a clean, cinematic way, more like drifting, in and out. Once you are gone, the battlefield does not mark the moment. You are one among many, dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands. If the battle was large, your body might remain there for days. Weather becomes a factor. So do scavengers. For most soldiers, the end of life on a battlefield was also the end of individual recognition. No marked grave. History books talk about battles, victories, defeats. They mention numbers. But the individual experience gets compressed into a single word: killed. Which is technically accurate, just missing a lot of detail. Imagine a cavalry charge, movement, speed, momentum, and then something interrupts it. A fall, a collision. In those moments, death could come more quickly. But even here, it is not always instant. There can be brief awareness. Most soldiers did not get that kind of ending. They got the slower version, the one that involved waiting. Many who died on the battlefield died afterward. Infection was a quiet and persistent problem, a different kind of slow. When we think about what it was like to die there, it is less about a single moment and more about a sequence, a slow unfolding. Not exactly the kind of thing that makes it into heroic ballads, but perhaps a little closer to the truth. If the battlefield itself was chaotic and strangely indifferent, the hours after it were quieter, but not necessarily kinder. In fact, for many soldiers, the real experience of dying didn't begin during the clash at all. It began afterward, when the noise faded and reality slowly settled in. Because here's the slightly uncomfortable truth. Surviving the battle didn't mean you were going to survive for long. Let's imagine you've made it past the initial fighting. Maybe you were dragged away, or maybe you crawled. Either way, you're no longer in immediate danger. That sounds like an improvement. But now you're entering a different phase entirely. The waiting phase. You're lying somewhere behind the lines. The ground is still not particularly comfortable, but at least it's not actively trying to kill you anymore. Around you are others in similar states. Some are quiet, some are not. There's a low, uneven chorus of groans and whispered prayers. And now, time slows down even more. At first, there's a kind of cautious hope. You're still alive. That feels like it should count. Maybe someone will come. Maybe there's a healer nearby. Maybe this will pass. But the body has its own timeline. If your wound is serious, blood loss continues to be a problem. It's less like a crisis and more like a quiet draining away of energy. You feel weaker. Your thoughts become hazier. Sitting up might feel like an ambitious goal, let alone standing. And then there's the pain. It changes. A deep, persistent ache that settles in and refuses to leave. It's constant, like a background noise your body can't turn off. If you're lucky, someone might attempt to treat your wound. A medieval surgeon was often more of a practical problem solver than a miracle worker. They had tools, knives, saws, bandages. But cleanliness was not a priority. Treatment might involve probing the wound, which is as pleasant as it sounds. If something needs to be removed, like an arrowhead, this is done quickly. Speed is the closest thing available to kindness. Pain relief is minimal. Maybe alcohol. Maybe a piece of wood to bite down on. You endure it because there aren't other options. If the injury involves a limb that can't be saved, amputation becomes a possibility. Survival sometimes came at a very high cost. The process is fast, efficient. The goal is to remove the damaged part before it causes further problems. But the story doesn't end there, because now we arrive at one of the most common causes of death: infection. At first, it doesn't always announce itself dramatically. The wound might look manageable, but then things shift. The area becomes warmer, swollen, painful in a different way, less sharp, more insistent. Fever might follow. Your body, trying to fight something it doesn't fully understand, begins to overheat. The experience becomes more about decline. Fever changes your perception. Time becomes strange. Thoughts drift. Soldiers become delirious, speaking in fragments, slipping in and out of awareness. It's not a quick process. Days can pass like this, each one slightly worse than the last. Strength fades, appetite disappears. Field hospitals are crowded, overwhelmed. There are more wounded than people to care for them. Attention is divided. Resources are limited. You're one among many. Beds are rare. Clean bandages are even rarer. The air might be heavy, the space cramped. And yet, within all of this, there are small human moments. Someone might offer you water, or sit nearby for a while. There's a kind of quiet solidarity among the wounded, a recognition that everyone here is navigating something similar. If you're fortunate, you might have a friend nearby, someone who recognizes you, reminds you that you're not entirely alone. As your condition worsens, interaction becomes harder. Speaking takes effort. Listening does too. Eventually, you might find yourself retreating inward. This is where the final phase begins. Your breathing changes. It might become slower or uneven. Your body is letting go. Pain might decrease. Not because things are improving, but because your body is running out of capacity to register it. There's a dulling. Awareness fades. You're not unconscious at first, but your connection to what's happening becomes thinner. Sounds are distant, light is less defined, and then there's a moment, quiet, unremarkable, where that connection slips away completely. No dramatic final words, just a gradual transition. And once again, the world continues. Your body remains. It becomes part of the same system, one among many. Burial, if it happens, is practical, efficient. There's rarely time for individual ceremonies. Graves are shared. Markers are minimal. For those who survive, the memory of this phase often lingers. A sense of how fragile the line between survival and death really was. Because that line was never clear. You could be caught in that in-between space where you're no longer part of the world, but not ready to leave. Some deaths were shaped by the environment, exhaustion, exposure, the slow wearing down of the body before a weapon ever made contact. And as we'll see, sometimes the battlefield didn't need to strike you directly to become the place where your story ended. Not every soldier needed a sword or an arrow, or even particularly bad luck with an enemy to die on a battlefield. Sometimes the battlefield itself handled the job, quietly, gradually, with a kind of slow persistence that didn't require much drama at all. Because before the fighting even began, your body was already being tested. Armies didn't arrive fresh and well-rested. They marched, for days, sometimes weeks, through heat, through cold, through rain that soaked everything and refused to leave. Your feet blistered early on, and then those blisters broke, and then you just kept walking anyway because, well, everyone else was. Food was inconsistent. Sometimes there was enough, sometimes there wasn't. And even when there was, it wasn't exactly comforting. Hard bread, salted meat, things that filled the stomach, but didn't necessarily help the body recover from what it was going through. Water, too, was a bit of a gamble. Clean sources weren't always available, so you drank what you could find and hoped your body didn't object too strongly. Sometimes it did. By the time you reached the battlefield, you were already a slightly worn-down version of yourself. Not dramatically weaker, but just enough that everything required a little more effort than it should. And then the waiting began. Battles didn't always start immediately. Armies faced each other, positioned themselves, watched, waited, sometimes for hours, sometimes longer, standing there, holding your weapon, trying not to think too much about what was coming. It's during this phase that exhaustion really settles in. Your legs begin to ache from standing, your shoulders tighten from holding your gear, Your mind drifts not out of calm, but out of a kind of quiet fatigue. You're alert, but also tired, ready, but also already worn down. Then the battle begins, and suddenly all that stored up fatigue has to be ignored. Adrenaline helps, of course. It pushes you forward, keeps you moving, keeps you reacting. But adrenaline is not a long-term solution. It's more like a temporary loan your body gives you, with the understanding that it will need to be repaid later. And later always comes. For some soldiers, the repayment began during the battle itself. Heat, for example, was a surprisingly effective opponent. Fighting under the sun, wearing armor or heavy clothing, moving constantly. Your body heats up quickly. Sweat helps, but only to a point. If there's not enough water to replace what you're losing, things start to go wrong. At first, it's just discomfort. You feel hotter than usual, thirstier. Your mouth dries out, your head feels a bit light. But then your body struggles to regulate itself. Your skin might become flushed, or oddly dry if sweating stops. Your thoughts slow down. Decision-making becomes less reliable. Simple things like maintaining your balance start to feel slightly off. And in the middle of a battle, slightly off is not ideal. If things continue, heat exhaustion can turn into heat stroke. Your body's temperature rises beyond what it can safely manage. Confusion deepens. You might stumble, collapse. From the outside, it might not even be immediately obvious what's happening. You're just another soldier going down. But the cause isn't a weapon. It's your own body reaching a limit it can't push past. Cold, on the other hand, had its own way of working. Battles fought in colder climates introduced a different kind of problem. Your body begins to restrict blood flow to your extremities. Fingers, toes, ears. They become numb, less responsive. At first, this is more inconvenient than dangerous. You lose some dexterity. Holding a weapon becomes slightly harder, but as time passes, the numbness deepens. Movement slows, reaction times increase, and if the exposure continues, if you're lying on the ground after being wounded, for example, the cold becomes more serious. Hypothermia doesn't announce itself loudly. It's a quiet process, a gradual lowering of body temperature that brings with it confusion, drowsiness, and a strange sense of calm. People often imagine freezing as something sharp and painful, but in reality, it can become oddly peaceful toward the end. You feel tired, very tired. The urge to rest becomes overwhelming, and if you give in to that urge, well, your body doesn't always wake you up again. So even without a direct injury, the battlefield had ways of wearing you down. Then there's the matter of sheer physical exhaustion. Fighting is not a gentle activity. It's intense, repetitive, and demanding. Swinging a weapon, holding a shield, moving in uneven terrain, all of it requires energy. A lot of it. After a while, your muscles begin to fail you. Your arms feel heavier. Your grip weakens slightly. Your steps become less steady. You push through it, because that's what everyone is doing. But your body keeps track. Eventually, the fatigue becomes overwhelming. You might slow down too much, miss a movement, fail to react in time, and that's often when an actual injury occurs, not because you lacked skill, but because your body simply couldn't keep up anymore. But sometimes, even without that final injury, exhaustion itself could be enough. There are accounts of soldiers collapsing from fatigue alone. Their bodies, pushed beyond what they could handle, simply shutting down. And on a battlefield, being unable to continue is a very vulnerable position to be in. Let's also consider something a bit less obvious. Dehydration. It sounds simple, almost too simple. But it was a constant issue. Water sources weren't always nearby, and even when they were, accessing them during a battle wasn't exactly convenient. So you went without. At first it's manageable. You feel thirsty. But as dehydration progresses, things become more serious. Your body struggles to maintain basic functions. Blood volume decreases, circulation becomes less efficient, your heart works harder. Mentally, you might feel foggy, slower, less focused. Physically, you're weaker, less coordinated. If dehydration becomes severe, it can lead to collapse. Your body, no longer able to maintain balance, simply gives up the effort. The battlefield was an environment that quietly pushed every participant toward their limits, and then a little beyond them. The world continues around you for a while, then begins to fade. The difference is that the cause is internal, a system failure. From the outside, it might not look very different. Another soldier down, another body among many. But the path that led there was slower, less visible, and in some ways more difficult to recognize. A soldier might receive a wound that, under better conditions, might have been survivable, but combined with everything else, it becomes too much. The body has a remarkable ability to endure, but it's not limitless. And the battlefield was very good at finding those limits. So when we think about what it was like to die there, it's about a collection of small stresses forming something difficult to overcome. A slow accumulation, a gradual wearing down, until eventually there's nothing left to give. Let's drift a little further now into a slightly different perspective, because not everyone on the battlefield was actively fighting, and for those caught in the margins of conflict, the experience of dying could take on yet another shape, equally quiet, equally overlooked. Not everyone who died on a battlefield arrived with a weapon in hand or a plan to fight. In fact, quite a few people found themselves there by accident, obligation, or simple bad timing, and their experience of dying followed the same slow, unremarkable rhythm, just from a slightly different starting point. Because battlefields, despite the name, were rarely tidy spaces reserved only for soldiers. They spilled outward, into nearby villages, into fields, into roads where people happened to be going about their day, not realizing history was about to roll over them like a very disorganized storm. Take camp followers, for example. They were a constant presence around armies, not officially part of the fighting force, but very much part of the overall picture. They cooked, cleaned, carried supplies, mended clothes, and generally kept things functioning in ways that rarely make it into heroic stories. Some were family members, wives, children, relatives who traveled alongside soldiers because separation wasn't always practical or possible. Others were merchants, opportunists, or simply people trying to make a living in the shadow of war. And when a battle began, they didn't always have the luxury of stepping aside. At first, there might be an attempt to move away, to gather belongings, to head toward what seems like a safer distance. But battle lines were not always predictable. What looked like a safe direction could quickly become the wrong one, so you might find yourself caught in the edges of the conflict. Not in the thick of it perhaps, but close enough that stray arrows become a concern. Close enough that fleeing soldiers pass by in a hurry, not always paying attention to who's in their path. Close enough that the noise and confusion make it difficult to understand what's happening or where to go. If injury comes in this situation, it feels even more sudden, less expected. You weren't braced for it in the same way a soldier might be. You didn't spend hours standing in formation, preparing yourself mentally for what could happen. You were just there. And then something went wrong. The experience afterward, though, is remarkably similar. You fall, or sit down, or simply stop moving. And now you're in the same position as everyone else who has been injured, on the ground, trying to understand what just changed. Around you, the battle continues, largely unaware of your specific situation. There's a certain quiet confusion that often appears in accounts like this. A sense of, this wasn't supposed to involve me. Help is even less certain here. You're not part of a unit. No one is specifically looking for you. There's no expectation that someone will come back for you once the fighting moves on. so you're left to navigate the aftermath on your own, or alongside others who are just as unprepared. If the wound isn't immediately fatal, the same slow process begins. Pain arrives, in waves or in a steady presence. Weakness follows. The ground becomes your main point of contact with the world, whether you're comfortable with that or not. And just like with soldiers, time stretches. You might try to move, to crawl toward what looks like safety. Sometimes that works, at least partially. But movement takes energy, and energy is already in short supply. Each small effort feels larger than it should, like your body is charging you extra for actions that used to be simple. If you manage to reach a quieter area, the experience becomes one of waiting. Waiting for help, waiting for the pain to lessen, waiting for something to change. And sometimes nothing does. Nearby villages, if they exist, might offer some form of refuge, but reaching them isn't guaranteed. And even if you do, resources are limited. Local inhabitants are dealing with the aftermath as well. Damaged property, missing supplies, their own injuries. So assistance, while possible, is not always sufficient. There's also the matter of fear, though it's often a quieter kind than we might expect. It's not always panic or terror. More often, it's a low, persistent uncertainty. A sense that things are not going to return to how they were, combined with a lack of clarity about what comes next. And as the body begins its gradual decline, that uncertainty tends to fade into something more neutral. Fatigue plays a role here too, just as it does for soldiers. The body, having endured stress, injury and confusion, begins to slow down, not dramatically, just enough that everything feels heavier, harder. Breathing becomes something you notice again. Not necessarily because it's painful, but because it's different, slower perhaps, or uneven, each breath requiring a bit more attention than the last. Thoughts become simpler, shorter. Holding on to complex ideas becomes difficult, so the mind focuses on immediate sensations instead. The ground beneath you, the air around you, the general sense of being here, in this moment, without much reference to anything beyond it. And then gradually, even that begins to fade. Awareness narrows, sounds become distant, light dims, not because it's physically changing, but because your perception of it is. The transition is quiet. There's no clear boundary where one state ends and another begins. Just a gradual slipping away from the experience of being present. And once again, the aftermath is practical. Bodies are gathered when possible, or left where they are if not. Identification is unlikely unless someone nearby recognizes you, which, for many camp followers or civilians, is less probable. Mass graves become the common solution, not out of disregard necessarily, but out of necessity. There are too many people, too little time, and not enough resources to handle each case individually. So you become part of a larger group, even in death. And history, as it tends to do, smooths over the details. When we read about battles, the focus is on armies, generals, strategies, outcomes. The presence of non-combatants is often mentioned only briefly, if at all. Their experiences, their endings, are folded into the general count of casualties, a word that feels neat and contained, despite everything it represents. But their experience of dying was no less real, no less slow, no less shaped by the same factors we've been drifting through: pain, exhaustion, confusion, and the gradual dimming of awareness. If anything, it was often more uncertain. They didn't have the framework of a soldier's role to place their experience into, no expectation of risk as part of a duty. Just the sudden realization that they had been pulled into something much larger than themselves, with very little control over how it unfolded. And yet, the ending remains familiar. A quiet stillness, a gradual release, a moment that passes without announcement. Let's drift a little further now into one more variation of this experience. Because even among soldiers, even among those fully engaged in the fighting, there were differences in how death arrived. Sometimes it was slow, as we've seen, sometimes shaped by the environment or by the aftermath, and sometimes it came in a way that felt almost immediate, though even that, as we'll see, has its own quiet complexities. Not every battlefield death stretched out into hours of waiting or days of slow decline. Some arrived much faster, or at least they appeared to from the outside. A sudden fall, a body hitting the ground mid-motion, a life that seemed to end in a single clean interruption. History likes these moments. They're easier to understand, easier to describe. He was struck down. Short, neat, and very convenient for storytelling. But even here, the reality is a little more layered, because quick on a battlefield doesn't always mean instant. Let's imagine one of the more abrupt scenarios. You're in the middle of movement, maybe advancing, maybe retreating, maybe just trying to stay upright in a situation that's becoming increasingly complicated. And then, without warning, something connects. A blow to the head, for example. This is one of the few cases where death could come very close to immediate. A strong enough impact, whether from a weapon, a fall, or even being thrown from a horse, can disrupt the brain in a way that stops things almost at once. From the outside, it looks sudden. One moment you're there, the next you're not. But from the inside, if there is a moment of awareness, it's brief. More confusion than pain, a flicker of disorientation, like the world has shifted out of alignment, and then nothing. No drawn-out realization, no slow fade, just a very quick transition. In a strange way, this was often considered one of the more fortunate endings. Not because it was good, but because it avoided everything we've already talked about: the waiting, the discomfort, the long decline. But even this kind of death wasn't always as clean as it appeared. Sometimes the injury was severe, but not immediately fatal. You might collapse, lose consciousness, and remain there, seemingly still. From a distance, it could look like the end had already come. But the body, stubborn as ever, might continue for a while longer. Breathing, shallow and uneven. A heartbeat, slower than it should be. Small, almost imperceptible signs that things are still in motion, even if awareness is gone. And in those cases, the process becomes a quiet extension. Time passes, the battle moves on, the environment takes over, and eventually the body follows the same path toward stillness. Then there are the moments that are fast, but not entirely immediate. A deep wound to the torso, for instance. Something that disrupts vital organs or causes significant internal damage. In these cases, you might remain conscious for a short time, not long. There's often a sense of sudden weakness, a rapid draining of energy, as if something essential has been turned off. Breathing might become difficult, not necessarily painful, but strained, each inhale feeling less effective than the last. You might try to move, but your body doesn't respond the way you expect. Coordination slips, strength fades quickly, and then, within minutes, sometimes less, the world begins to narrow. Vision might blur or darken at the edges. Sounds become distant, as if they're happening somewhere else. Thoughts, which were already struggling to keep up, begin to dissolve entirely. Cavalry, as we briefly touched on earlier, introduced another kind of quick death. Falling from a moving horse is not a gentle event. The speed, the height, the unpredictability of where you land, all of it contributes to outcomes that can change very quickly. A bad fall could lead to immediate unconsciousness, or to injuries that make it impossible to continue moving, leaving you vulnerable. There are also collisions to consider. Two riders meeting at speed, or a rider encountering an obstacle they didn't see in time. These moments are chaotic, sudden, and often resolved before the mind has time to fully process what's happening. Even weapons designed for close combat could produce these faster endings. A well-placed strike could end a life quickly. But well-placed and accurate were not always guaranteed in the confusion of battle, so while some ended decisively, many did not. And even in the cases where they did, there's still that brief window, a second, maybe less, where the body registers that something has happened. It's not dramatic, not drawn out, just a small, quiet interruption before everything stops. Now, it's worth noting that these quicker deaths, while real, were not the majority. Most experiences lean toward the slower end, but the presence of these faster endings adds another layer, because it means that on the same field, different people were experiencing very different versions. One person might fall and be gone within moments. Another might lie there for hours, fully aware of everything unfolding around them. And from a distance, those differences disappear. They become numbers, totals, words like casualties, which are efficient but not descriptive. When we take the time to look a little closer, to slow things down and follow each thread, the picture becomes more varied, more human. Even in a quick death, there's nuance. A brief passage through awareness, through sensation, through the body's final attempts to understand. And then, as always, there's the same quiet ending. A stillness that arrives without announcement. A moment that blends into all the others around it. Let's drift a little further now, into one final layer. Because beyond the physical side, there's also the question of what it felt like mentally, how the mind responded as the body moved through these stages. That part of the story is just as subtle, and perhaps even more quietly complex. If the body had its own slow, practical way of shutting down, the mind followed a path that was a little harder to pin down, less physical, less visible, but just as steady in its own quiet way. Because when people imagine the final moments of a battlefield death, they often picture clarity, a sudden understanding, maybe even a meaningful reflection on life, as if the mind neatly organizes everything before stepping away. History, once again, offers a gentler, more ordinary version. For most, the mind didn't sharpen at the end, it softened. Let's begin earlier, just before things go wrong. You're already tired, your body is worn down, your senses slightly overloaded. Battle is not a place for careful reflection. It's a place of reaction, instinct, and survival. So when the injury happens, your mind doesn't immediately switch into some profound mode of understanding. It stumbles. There's confusion first, a brief, disjointed moment where things don't quite line up. You might not even realize you've been seriously injured right away. Just a sense that something is off, that the world has shifted slightly. Then comes recognition, not always dramatic, often very simple. Something like, "This is bad." A quiet awareness that the situation has changed in a way that isn't going to reverse itself. After that, the mind begins to narrow its focus. Complex thoughts become difficult to maintain. What remains are immediate sensations. The ground beneath you, the effort of breathing, the presence of light or shadow. It's not panic, at least not in the way we might expect. There are moments of fear, certainly, but they tend to come and go. The body doesn't have the energy to sustain intense emotion for long, so even fear becomes muted, softer around the edges. In many accounts, there's a kind of detachment that sets in, a sense that what's happening is happening at a slight distance, as if you're observing your own experience rather than being fully inside it. This is the mind quietly stepping back. And as the body continues to weaken, that detachment deepens. Time becomes even less reliable. Moments blend together. Minutes could feel like hours, or hours could pass without much sense of duration at all. Thoughts, too, become simpler. Instead of structured ideas, you might experience fragments, brief images, half-formed memories, a face, perhaps. A place that feels familiar, even if you can't fully place it. Not in a dramatic way. More like the mind picking up small, quiet pieces of itself and holding onto them for a moment before letting them go. There's also the matter of acceptance. It's a gradual absence of resistance. The urgency to change the situation fades. In some cases, there's even a kind of calm. Not happiness, just a neutral stillness. A pause in the constant effort. Breathing becomes the central focus again. Each inhale, each exhale, noticed not out of mindfulness, but because it's one of the few things happening. Awareness fades in layers. First, the environment. The sounds of the battlefield, already distant, slip further away. Then the body itself. Sensations dull. The boundaries between where you end and the ground begins become harder to define. Finally, the sense of self. The simple awareness of being here, in this moment. That too begins to thin out. And then, quietly, it's gone. No clear line, no sudden shift. Just the absence of what was there before. From the outside, it looks like stillness. A body at rest, no longer part of the movement around it. But when we slow things down, a different picture emerges. One that is softer, more gradual, more human. A series of small transitions rather than one defining moment. A process that unfolds quietly, often unnoticed. Not how loud the battlefield was, but how quietly so many lives ended within it. As the sounds fade, and as the field returns to stillness, what remains is not the noise of the battle, but the quiet that follows. A quiet that holds everything that happened there, and slowly, gently lets it rest. It